Hi, Black Cat Recapped here. Today I am going to explain a drama movie named Gran Torino. The movie starts with a funeral in a church. There's a man named Walt Kowalski, and his wife, Dorothy, passed away. Walt is a war veteran, and he and Dorothy had 2 kids, Mitch and Steve. They also have 1 granddaughter and 3 grandsons. During the funeral, Walt's granddaughter wore clothes that he didn't like, but he's very sad because he lost his wife, who was the only person who really understood him. Many of Dorothy's relatives attended the funeral, and after the church ceremony, there was a gathering at Walt's house. It was noisy, so Walt decided to be by himself. He went to his garage and found his granddaughter smoking there. In the garage, there's also a 1972 Ford Gran Torino car. His granddaughter asked what would happen to the car when he passed away, but Walt didn't answer and walked away. When Walt came back home, a young priest told him that Dorothy had asked him to look after Walt and encouraged him to confess something he had never confessed before. Walt said he wouldn't confess to someone younger than him. Next to Walt's house, there's a group of Chinese people with the last name Meng. There's a young man named Tao among them, who is not treated well by his family because he follows his older brother's orders too obediently. Walt seemed unhappy about the new Chinese neighbors and wondered why they had moved into his neighborhood. The next day, Tao was walking alone and reading a book when some American gangsters in a car started harassing him. At the same time, another car with Asian gangsters, including Tao's cousin, arrived. They argued for no clear reason, and one of the American gangsters pulled out a gun. This made one of the Asian gangsters, Smokey, show an Uzi-type weapon, and the American gangsters walked away. The Asian gangsters approached Tao, and one of them, named Spider, tried to make him join their gang, but Tao wasn't interested in violence and trouble. They eventually left him alone, and he continued on his way. Out of the blue, Spider and his friends came over to Tao's house while he was working in the yard. His sister, Sue, was on the house's porch. The Asian gangsters pressured Tao to join their group. Sue decided to go back into the house. Tao felt forced, so he reluctantly agreed to join them. His first task as a gang member was to steal his neighbor Walt's car, a Gran Torino. In the evening, Tao attempted to steal Walt's car. However, Walt seemed to notice someone trying to break into his garage. He grabbed his rifle and went to the garage to scare away the thief. Tao got scared by Walt's actions and fled Walt's house. In the dark garage, Walt couldn't clearly see who was trying to steal his car. The gang of gangsters waited for Tao outside Walt's house. The next day, Walt fixed his garage to prevent a similar incident from happening again. Walt's eldest son called him. When he answered the call, it seemed like his eldest son wasn't asking how he was feeling. Instead, his son was interested in his late wife's jewelry. This annoyed Walt, so he hung up the phone. Afterward, he relaxed in front of his house, just gazing at the Gran Torino parked in his driveway. That night, Spider and his friends showed up at Tao's house, trying to get him to rejoin their group. However, this time, the gangsters were quite forceful, pulling Tao from where he was sitting in his yard. This commotion brought the rest of Tao's family out of the house, trying to break up the fight. The situation escalated, and they ended up in Walt's yard. Walt had been watching the chaos and was ready to point his gun at them when they entered his property. Gangsters decided to leave. The Tao family thanked Walt for making the gangsters go away, but Walt told them to stay away from his property. The next day, Walt was surprised to find a variety of food and gifts in his yard. It turned out the Tao family was showing gratitude for his actions, even though Walt wasn't used to helping others and simply didn't want his yard disturbed. Later, Tao and his mother approached Walt. Tao apologized for trying to steal Walt's car the other day. Walt warned him not to repeat the mistake and said he wouldn't hesitate to take action if it happened again. In the afternoon, Sue was walking to the record store with her friend. On the way, they encountered a group of troublemakers who started bothering them. Sue wasn't afraid, but that only seemed to encourage the troublemakers. At an intersection, Walt appeared and approached them. Walt hinted at having a weapon, making the gang of troublemakers underestimate him even more. But they were in for a surprise when Walt suddenly pulled a real gun out of his pocket. He told Sue to get into his car. On the way, they chatted a bit. Walt was friendlier than usual, and Sue responded well to his conversation. A few days later, Walt was sitting in front of his house when he saw his elderly neighbor drop her groceries from the back of her car. At the same time, a group of young people passed by, but instead of helping, they made fun of the woman. Walt seemed like he was about to get up from his chair, but before he could, he saw Tao rushing over to the old woman and helping her carry her things into the house. Not long after, Sue came to invite Walt to a barbecue at their house. Walt checked his empty stash of beer and realized he was out. He accepted Sue's invitation, hoping to get a beer from their place. When Walt arrived, Sue's family warmly welcomed him, except for Sue's grandmother, who still had reservations about him. In the family, there was a healer who had a keen eye for people's pasts. The healer looked into Walt's dark history and said that Walt had made some serious mistakes that were still weighing on him. After hearing this, Walt decided to be alone for a while. Shortly after, he felt the need to use the bathroom. While in there, he noticed that he was coughing up blood, which was a sign that he wasn't well. When he left the bathroom, Sue asked how he was feeling, but Walt pretended that he was okay. As he was about to leave the house, Sue's mother mentioned that Tao wanted to make amends for trying to steal his car by offering money or help. Sue's family emphasized that it was important, and they would feel hurt if Walt refused. So, Walt agreed to Tao's offer and hired him the next day. At home, Walt was coughing up blood more frequently and decided to see a doctor. The doctor's examination revealed that Walt had a serious illness, and his time left on Earth was limited. This prompted Walt to reach out to his children individually in the hope of repairing their strained relationships. However, his good intentions were ignored by his busy children. The following day, Walt hired Tao to do various tasks, from fixing roofs and clearing trees to cleaning cars, moving heavy objects, and painting houses. Tao did all of this to distance himself from the Asian gangsters who frequently passed by their house. While observing Tao, Walt realized that he was a shy and insecure young man. This touched Walt's heart, and he decided to help Tao become more resilient. Tao was then given a job at one of Walt's friends' factories, owned by Tim Kennedy. Tim welcomed Tao as an employee and promised to find a position for him in the factory. A few days later, Tao officially started working at Tim's factory. On his way home from work one day, Tao encountered a group of Asian gangsters who had previously harassed him. Then, they attacked Tao, and one of them burned him with a cigarette on his cheek. After this terrible incident, Tao continued on his way home without his work tools because the gangsters had damaged them. On his way, Walt ran into Tao and realized that he had just been bullied by a gang of gangsters. Walt went to the gang's base, but he only found Smokey. He ended up beating up Smokey and warned him not to bother Tao if he wanted to avoid more trouble. One night, Walt was in his living room when Spider's group passed by Tao's house and fired shots as a warning. Walt heard this and rushed to check on his neighbor. Luckily, Tao had only a minor scratch on his neck, and no one else in the family was hurt. Tao then remembered that Sue was at her friend's house. He hurried to contact Sue's friend, who said that Sue had left about an hour ago. They waited anxiously for Sue to return home, fearing that the gang might do something to her. Soon after, they heard Sue in pain from outside the house. They rushed to her and found that she had been badly hurt all over her body, which made her family and Walt very sad and devastated. Walt excused himself and went back to his house because his emotions were getting the better of him. He decided to confess to the priest. Walt confessed to killing many innocent people while fighting in Korea. Afterward, he asked for permission to carry out another attack, but this time he claimed it was for a good reason, to protect Tao and Sue's family. Together with Tao, he prepared the rifle he had for a long time. Tao also wanted to avenge his sister by killing Smokey and his friends. Walt then awarded Tao a silver star as a way of showing appreciation for his courage. However, Walt suddenly locked Tao in the basement. It seemed that he had a plan for revenge and didn't want anyone else to be involved. Walt left his dog with Tao's grandma and then called Sue to tell her where Tao was locked in the basement. That night, Walt went to the gangsters' hideout, and they were all armed and ready. Walt signaled to shoot them one by one with his bare hands. He then reached into his pocket, making the gangsters believe he was taking out a gun, but he actually pulled out a cigarette. Suddenly, he put his hands in his pockets quickly, and the gangsters shot him, thinking he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he took out a match from his shirt. Neighbors who saw the incident called the police, and the gangsters were arrested for shooting an unarmed man. It turned out that Walt didn't seek revenge but sacrificed himself to protect Tao and Sue's families. He knew his life was ending, so he chose to die as a hero. A few days after Walt's funeral, city officials held a ceremony to distribute his inheritance. It was revealed that Walt had left his house to the church at his late wife's request. He also left his Gran Torino car to Tao because Tao had been with him until the end of his life.